My guess is that the demographic of most of the churches represented here is predominantly white, predominantly middle class. People tend to drive to your church because of the type of church it is. If you meet in a Victorian chapel like we do, you can be pretty sure that it wasn't like that when the church was founded. The men listed in the trust deed for Rehoboth Chapel, Coventry, what it used to be called before it being called Lower Ford Street, were tollgate keepers and ribbon weavers and artisan workers. Most of them, of course, walked to chapel, though some did come quite a distance because of the kind of church it was. Historians tell us that nonconformity in its origins was largely working class, lower middle class. There were some prominent rich businessmen, but the professional classes tended towards the established church. As nonconformity has developed with its work ethic, its adherents have tended to show upward social mobility. So the churches today tend to be dominated by professional people with middle-class values and lifestyle and education, insofar that these categories and distinctions can still be accurately defined. So is there now a kind of class wall in our churches? How effectively are we reaching out to factory workers, lorry drivers, bar staff, people living on benefits? Do we have these people in our sights? Tomorrow we'll have a paper on William Gadsby. William Gadsby preached with great effectiveness among working people as one of them. With our appetite today for cerebral preaching and worship, how do factory workers cope in our churches with the length of our sermons and so on? If God was to gift this kind of a man from this kind of a background, as he does, to preach the gospel, how would we prepare him? Would we be equipped to? Would we prepare such a man? Wouldn't we need to organize tailor-made training schemes for such men? And I was struck that the kind of study week that some of us were hearing about last night would be a good model for this. Can I take as a working assumption, based on the biblical principles that we looked at in the first session, that as a minimum, our churches should be both reaching out to and reflecting the same kind of demographic as is in our geographical catchment as local churches? So we're not talking about anything artificial here. We're not talking about going on a guilt trip because we don't have factory workers or students or Chinese or Africans in our churches if none live round us. The question is, does your church reflect and reach out to and pray for the sort of social demographic in your village, in your town, in your inner city area, or on your estate? And how aware are you of current changes in that demographic? Do you accept that if each local church is to be truly indigenous, it does need to be rooted in the soil of its culture? Is there such a thing as a Christian view of culture? In his helpful book, Unreached, Tim Chester has 6 principles to shape a Christian view of culture. Number one, God creates culture and he delights in cultural variety. Number two, sin distorts culture and creates cultural conflict. Number three, the gospel both affirms and judges every culture. And here Chester quotes the Lausanne Covenant, which says the gospel does not presuppose the superiority of any culture to another, but evaluates all cultures according to its own criteria of truth and righteousness, and insists on moral absolutes in every culture. Number four, Christians should both affirm and transform cultures. Christians should both affirm and transform cultures. Number five, the gospel transcends culture without denying cultural differences. And number six, missional engagement with culture is a two-way process. The point here is that we're often so immersed in our own culture that we don't even notice it. We're blind, both to the defects of our culture and to the strengths of the culture that we're bringing the gospel to. I was talking to a Zambian brother at coffee time who had been in this country for many years, and we were just discussing some of the strengths of the culture that he comes from, which could well be picked up and explored and benefited from here, if only we had more listening ears to it. We all know about missionary imperialism, how some missionaries take the gospel into a culture but also impose on it, and the way they do church, their own cultural, extra-biblical cultural norms. We're less aware, perhaps, that this can happen at home in our multicultural society. Do you ever think about your church culture, defining culture for the moment quite broadly to mean the way we do things around here? You know, when you walk into a church service, you do get a feel, don't you, for the way things are done. Visiting preachers especially know this. You go and your sort of antennae are out, and you soon pick up the sort of the subcultures of the local church. For example, in your church, do people talk to each other in the same friendship groups each week? Or do they move out of their comfort zone in order to welcome newcomers and strangers and perhaps lonely people? Are children welcome, or are they just kind of tolerated? Do the leaders behave as self-forgetful servants or self-conscious of authority? I sometimes wonder whether when elders troop out at the beginning, suited elders troop out at the beginning of a service, that they're making a statement about authority. Is diversity within constraints of biblical freedom acceptable, or are people expected to conform maybe to a dress code, for example? What about a culture of hospitality? Does that exist in your church? Now, staying with the middle-class, working-class trajectory, Chester, in his book, identifies middle-class values reflected in evangelicalism today. We value professionalism, we like programs, we like diary, we like schedule, we like punctuality, we're a bit suspicious of enthusiasm. University education is seen as the primary means of self-improvement. We assume that all our leaders will be university educated. You know, at the very least, we need to become a little bit more self-aware as how we look to the world beyond us. But perhaps at this point I need to just raise an objection. Because there is a school of thought which says in evangelism and church planting that we should follow what's called the HUP, the homogeneous unit principle. The question is asked, who is your focus group? Who are you trying to reach? Is it students? Is it people on the estate? Is it Muslims? Who is it? Who's your focus group? And the assumption is that people don't like crossing racial, linguistic, age, or class barriers, and therefore it's better to bring the gospel to them in their natural group. Now that sounds like good practice, doesn't it? But having laid the groundwork that we did in the first session, I really do question whether it truly reflects the biblical principles that we were looking at then. There is evidence in the New Testament of what we might call targeted gospel preaching, preaching to Jews, preaching to pagans. The 1 Corinthians 9 passage seems to presuppose it. But the destination, it always seems to me, in the New Testament, is a composite, diverse church. And as we saw, the early church went through a lot of pain in order to become that. The middle wall of separation is broken down by Jesus Christ. And the mystery of Ephesians 3 is precisely this mystery, isn't it? In chapter 3, verse 3, Paul says, how that by revelation he made known to me the mystery. He talks about the mystery, and then he says in verse 6 what the mystery is, that the Gentiles should be fellow heirs of the same body and partakers of his promise in Christ through the gospel. So this is the mystery, all one in Christ. It's a mystery so far as the world is concerned. And if we can identify a biblical principle of accommodation and equality, what's the point of that if our church life doesn't need those things? One thing, of course, that facilitated the growth and spread of the gospel in the New Testament church was a universal language in the providence of God. Greek was the universal language. There were local languages, but almost everyone knew Greek. And the language barriers that we now have make it much more likely that homogeneous churches are going to spring up. In Coventry, there are dozens, literally dozens, of specific language, people, group churches. And it seems natural for these to develop. Yet I still question whether this truly reflects the New Testament vision for the church. Is this how it ought to be? Shouldn't we be working towards a church on earth that genuinely reflects the church in heaven? Now, there are ways round language barriers. They require grace and long-suffering that we read of, expense. But surely it's worth it. Surely this is a goal that's worth pressing on to. Beyond this, there seems to be an increasing number of churches which are working on the principle that people self-select in terms of their preferences when it comes to church. It's a kind of consumer mentality, isn't it? And Reformed Baptists are as guilty of it as anyone. You go shopping for the church that you prefer and for the kind of worship that you like best. But some churches actually encourage this internally, don't they? It's a sort of species of individualism that we were thinking about yesterday. So people divide into groups, students, young people, families, older people, with their different preferences, a family service, a conservative worship, contemporary worship, and so on. Now, in our church, we do have 2 morning services to accommodate the people, but we run exactly the same service in terms of hymns and readings, and we don't give people options, or we don't allow them to have preferences of a kind of worship, because we are one church, although in our situation we have to have 2 meetings. You know, preferences are often dressed up as needs, aren't they? But it doesn't fit with the biblical vision of church that we saw in the first session. Now, I must freely admit that I have sometimes wondered, and do wonder in our setting in Coventry, because of the difficulties of communicating the gospel with people of absolutely no experience of church, whether a different kind of service should be available to people on benefits or drug addicts or prostitutes. Well, perhaps that could be helpful and necessary to targeting before integration. But in the light of what we were seeing, don't you think that the whole church should be willing and able to cross whatever barriers there are, however painful they may be, because integration is our goal, one church? If that is the case, then we should be aiming and praying for our churches to reflect the kind of social ethnic mix in which God has placed them. And if it's true that that isn't yet the case, then there's work to be done. A little bit of wall woodpecking to do, consciously chipping away at the barriers that divide people. To use another picture, we need to get the nursery ready. Young parents expecting their first child and hoping for subsequent children recognize that new life in the family is going to bring change, radical change. So they redecorate a bedroom, they buy a cot, they hang one of those rather silly mobiles over it, they buy baby clothes, they prepare for the new arrivals. It's natural, isn't it? But most of the big changes happen when the little ones actually arrive. Now, early in my ministry, I preached on Isaiah chapter 54. It shows the fruit of the finished work of Jesus, so poignantly portrayed in chapter 53. And it begins, you remember, with a barren woman who's commanded to sing because there are children on the way. And she's to stitch new canvas, and she's to enlarge the family tent. And there must be more fabric, and there must be longer guy ropes. And at the same time as the longer guy ropes, there must be stronger stakes. It was a passage that William Carey preached on in his famous missionary address to the particular Baptists of the Northamptonshire Association. Attempt great things for God, expect great things from God. But there are 2 commensurate activities, strengthening stakes and lengthening cords, and they both need to happen. We need to strengthen the things that are most surely believed among us, and at the same time, we need to reach out and expect new growth. We can perhaps project 2 models of church growth or church life. One is a big marquee. There's lots of activity, there's lots of noise, but it's not very securely grounded. And it's a disaster waiting to happen when the wind blows. The other is a small tent with massive tent pegs, driven into the ground, cozy in there, and snug, and safe. And it's been there like that forever. But not much vision, not much expectation. You know, we need both things, don't we? We need to strengthen the stakes, and we need to lengthen the cords. And we need to do both things together. Perhaps you'll allow me to say a few things about what this has meant for us as a church in Coventry over the last 30 years or so of my ministry there. When I began my ministry in 1985, we were a small, very conservative, white, predominantly middle-class church emerging from a gospel standard background. And some of you here will know exactly what that means. Some things in our church life were really crying out for change. If we were going to begin to prepare the nursery, if we were going to reach out and welcome in new converts from our neighbourhood, which is an edge of city social priority area, was then, is now. Very slowly, under God's gracious hand, we began to make some changes to get the nursery ready. And God began to send different people to us as we did that. Over the years before that, we'd had more than our fair share of odd-bod visitors. Small, over-defined congregations do seem to attract them, don't they? These sort of rather strange characters that appear and hang around for a while. But now different kinds of people began to arrive and to stay. Afro-Caribbeans were the first, actually. And when they found that they were genuinely welcome, they began to invite their friends. And then we began to see a trickle, and it's never been more than that, but a trickle of working class people converted and join with us. And at the same time, a significant ministry among students. The accommodation for Coventry University is all around us, and it brings many international students. So we began to meet people from all over the African continent, Asians, East Asians, Eastern Europeans, and so on. And as the congregation became more ethnically and socially mixed, people began to feel more welcome, more at home. Recently, someone counted 26 different nationalities on a Sunday morning. Just in the last few months, a visiting lecturer to Coventry University from China has been wonderfully converted. Now, what kind of things have we addressed to facilitate this? Now, I don't want to give the impression at all that we have any recipe for success. God has been gracious to us. He has overruled our mistakes, as he wonderfully does. Miraculously, and it is a miracle, he has kept us largely together as a congregation, despite some changes which, for us, were quite seismic. I could make a list of things. When I began my ministry, it was mandatory for women to have their heads covered for worship. Women were not allowed to pray in public in the prayer meetings. It was an AV-only church. We sang from Gadsby's selection of hymns. There was an extremely narrow approach to communion. These things we began to address. We introduced children's talks. I well remember the first time I did that and the sense of nervousness about doing it. We called an evangelist to help mobilize us all in personal evangelism and reaching out to the neighborhood, to go out into our neighborhood. We began a program of door-to-door ministry and so on. Now, some of these changes were hard for us to make in view of where the church was and in view of where I was coming from personally. Perhaps I can just touch on one or two areas of change which I believe have been about being hospitable to people from different social and ethnic backgrounds. And then on one area where we've still got a long way to go. There are many areas where we've still got a long way to go, but I want to touch on one. The first area in which we've made change, which is, I believe, hospitable to people from different social and ethnic backgrounds, is what I'm calling ambience. Now, you might say, well, that's a hopelessly woolly sort of idea. But we have changed the ambience of our chapel in a number of ways. In the late 90s, we took out the old pulpit and pews, and we used chairs arranged in a sort of curved shape around a platform against the long wall. One of the old ministers who preached in the church for many, many years was very gracious when he saw this. And he came and he saw the platform against the long wall, and he said, "You know, the Puritans used to do it that way." So I breathed a huge sigh of relief. But you see, it did create greater eye contact, which is important when you're talking to people. Eye contact is important. And it did help people to meet each other and talk to each other after the service. When you've got a city centre church which is jam-packed full of wooden seats, so you can only talk to somebody in the aisle, and then you spill out into a busy road where there's nowhere where people can talk, to create a space within the chapel where people can talk is a no-brainer, really, isn't it? But it can take years to get to these no-brainers. Since then, in 2014, we had a major development of the whole site in which we used the height of the chapel to create an extra floor all the way through, and that way to enhance our facilities. Now, in both those developments, we were concerned to open up the entrances and to make the church more visible from the outside. People were worried about vandalism when we knocked down the front wall and gates. But their fears about that haven't proved to be grounded at all. There have been no problems. And we have a much more open approach to people who are walking past us. And welcomers on a Sunday quite often go right out into the streets to talk to the people who are passing by. Our approach to the atmosphere before the service begins has changed significantly. There used to be this kind of sepulchral silence as people prepared for worship. Now we encourage people to pray at home. We say, please continue to prepare. Please continue to pray. But surely that can be done at home. And then when you come to church, come ready to welcome people. Expect newcomers. Go out of your way to talk to them before the service, not just after the service, but make them welcome. So now there's a buzz right up to the beginning of the service. And some people have found that a bit difficult to adjust to. But as I said, gospel-driven change, if it is that, gospel-driven change, then it can be painful. Our elders don't troop in formally, but mingle with the congregation before a service and greet people right up to the beginning of the worship. And we do expect newcomers. And one of the slides on the screen welcomes people in different languages, hopefully in theirs. There was in our church, as you might imagine, a residual belief, as there is in many churches today, that the worship area is a kind of sanctuary, a holy place. Old Testament. Absolutely Old Testament. Nothing New Testament about that, whatever. The church in the New Testament is never a building. It is never a holy place. It's the people of God. But if you've got a residual belief that the sanctuary is a holy place, then this makes things difficult, because for us, the chapel was the only space we had. So we were really forced to address it biblically. So now the auditorium can be used in a multifunctional way. Dress code is also something that has changed. When I began my ministry, most of the men wore suits and ties. The women dressed up and wore hats, sometimes looked a bit like Ascot. Now there's no dress code except what conforms, hopefully, to biblical standards of modesty. The idea isn't that everyone dresses down and we develop a new conformity. That's always the danger, isn't it? That's not the idea. But that people dress in what feels right for them, culturally and conscientiously. And that way, anyone who comes in feels affirmed in what they are wearing, so long as it's modest. We also needed to adapt to some pretty un-British behaviour on a number of fronts, especially punctuality. We can be not very tolerant about things like punctuality. And then there were customs at events like weddings and funerals, where people would turn up with ideas for the programme just 2 minutes before the event began. That kind of thing. Our expectations about new members attending church meetings. Now, this doesn't amount to a sort of laissez-faire policy, but a recognition that some of our habits and expectations are cultural rather than biblical, and that it's better to draw people rather than to legislate them into good cultural practice, where cultural practice is good. You know, many Africans are used to Sunday morning church at home, which goes on for 3 hours. And having had that marathon in the morning, they're not used to coming out again in the evening. Now, I'm not saying that that can't or shouldn't change, but at least we need to understand it. We need to be aware of it. We need to think these things through. So ambience is important. Secondly, intelligibility, if I can say it. Now, as I've said, I was brought up in an AV-only context, singing only Gadsby's hymns, and I inherited a theological phraseology that just kind of flowed out of me naturally when I began to preach. It was just there. So it wasn't easy for me to change Bible version or to do the evangelical long jump, which we've in fact done by moving from Gadsby's to praise with supplementary modern songs as well. But I have come to believe that intelligibility is a biblical principle. In the context of speaking with tongues, the Apostle Paul says, I'd rather speak 5 words with the understanding than 10,000 in an unknown tongue. If the trumpet gives an uncertain sound, who's going to prepare himself for the battle? Who's going to get ready? And if you've tried teaching the Bible to people for whom English is a second language, or for people who are struggling educationally at school, if you've tried to do that using the authorized version, then you'll know that this puts a barrier in their way that doesn't need to be there. And you know that if you use Elizabethan language in your worship, then you're using language which is another language for the people to learn that you're expecting them to learn. Now, I was influenced early on by an Anglican, a good Anglican. His name was J.C. Ryle. He wrote this. He said, I crucified my style to speak to the common man. That's interesting, isn't it? Crucified is a very strong word. In a Victorian age of oratory, pulpiteering, it was a very conscious sacrifice that man made. But we still reap the benefit of it, don't we? You take something like his expository thoughts on the Gospels. They're short sentences, aren't they? Pithy, easy to read. But that didn't come without cost and without effort. He deliberately addressed the issue because he wanted to talk to the working man. He wanted to communicate. And I do value the advice that my pastor gave me when I first started to preach. He said, speak to the intelligent 12-year-old. It's good advice. When Ezekiel wanted to understand the exiles, he sat where they sat. And we do need to get inside the skin of the people that we're trying to reach, don't we? We need to sit where they sit. People from different social backgrounds to us, people from different ethnicities. It's biblical to do that, surely. So, ambience, intelligibility, outreach. Now, I don't have time to explore this, but for us, it's been really the single biggest area of change. We weren't really into evangelism at all in the old days, so we've kind of had to wake up. But if we're to reach people in the neighbourhood of our churches, we've realised that we need to go out to them. It's not just about inviting them to church, it is about that. But it's also about being visible in our communities, getting involved. So ministries of gospel outreach need to be developed which welcome people into the church and meet them where they are. And these will be different for different churches, I suggest, depending on your catchment area, dependent on the demographic in your particular area. Now, the one area where we've especially still got a long way to travel as a local church, and that is full integration. A long way to go. For example, our eldership, although we have this multicultural congregation, our eldership at Lower Ford Street is entirely white, middle class. We did have a Zambian brother who was an elder, but he's now sadly moved away. Our diaconate is also, at present, exclusively white, but is a bit more varied socially. We find it hard for members' meetings to be truly representative of the ethnic and social diversity of the church, because people have to learn our administrative ways. They don't just naturally clock on to it. You announce members' meetings, they are members, but they don't think it's them. For some reason, they don't think it's for them. They don't come. And when they don't come, then that has a knock-on kind of effect. We do have an African couple who are home group leaders. We have others that we're training up. I do sometimes wonder whether we should use positive discrimination to try to fast-track people from other cultures into leadership. But of course, we mustn't compromise on the biblical qualifications, must we? We do try to invite Asian and African preachers when we can. But they're rather thin on the ground, especially in our constituency. But imagine you're a black person and you're sitting in an otherwise multicultural church, but you seldom, if ever, see a black person on the platform or leading in worship or leading a ministry or an outreach event. Every now and then in our church we have lunch together and a full meal is cooked for perhaps 120, 150 people. Up till last time we did it, it's been organised by the white people in the congregation. Last time we asked our black and Asian friends to organise it and to cook ethnic food. And it was a resounding success, and it was delicious as well. You say, well, that's still a long, long way from full integration. Because with full integration, you don't even notice these things, do you? When I was a teacher, I didn't used to notice. I was in an ethnically mixed school. And I just didn't used to notice. It didn't register with me after a while what racial background people were from, what colour their skin was. Didn't notice it. And I think that's our real goal, isn't it? That's our target. That's what we should be aiming at. And so we're still a long way away. But we need to get to where we need to get to by small steps. And we need to keep this vision, don't we? One Lord, one faith, one baptism. We haven't arrived, none of us have, There's still a long, long way to travel. How do we integrate the warehouse operative who's recently been converted, as in our church, and has had habits of smoking and drug taking? It's a real challenge. How is such a person integrated? It's not just about their conversion, is it? It's about their discipleship. It's about their life as a Christian in the surrogate family of the people of God. So I end with a quotation from Don Carson in his book Love in Hard Places, where he suggests that ideally the church isn't composed of natural friends, but rather natural enemies. And he says, what binds us together is not common education, common race, common income levels, common politics, common nationality, common accents, common jobs, or anything of the sort. Christians come together not because they form a natural collocation, but because they have been saved by Jesus Christ and owe him a common allegiance. In the light of this common allegiance, in light of the fact that they've all been loved by Jesus himself, they commit to doing what he says, and he commands them to love one another. In this light, they are a band of natural enemies who love one another for Jesus' sake. So what Paul writes in Galatians 3:28 is truly radical, isn't it? And has massive implications for us and for our churches. There is neither Jew nor Greek. There is neither slave nor free. There is neither male nor female, for you all are one in Christ Jesus. Amen.